The evidence on which the conviction of Lucy Letby was founded has long since been eviscerated. In this new series, as an emblem of this, I will address an array of pro-guilty arguments, some of which were used in court, some of which were disseminated via the media, and some of which germinated online. The first part of the series will focus on the psychology and behaviour of Lucy Letby, the anecdotal evidence used in court, the police investigation, and the strength of the court process. The first comment that we often encounter on TikTok is that Lucy confessed in her diary. Now, I don't want to spend an enormous amount of time on this because it's simply categorically incorrect. It's not even something that was alleged in court. Lucy's diary doesn't contain a confession. This is mixing up the diary with notes that were recovered from her house. The second comment that will be made about Lucy's diary, although this is hardly ever made now because it's been completely discredited, was the suggestion made by police that there is a code in Lucy's diary. Now, this is, again, just categorically incorrect. They cited particularly this LD entry that you can see here. She's made on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. We know that stands for long day. It was even referenced in court. It was even referenced in court by another nurse who didn't even know she'd written in her diary. So this is just something that has no merit. But to be perfectly honest, if you look at the pages of her diary that were released, that were shown possibly to the court, and the police have recovered and placed in the media, it's very clear that there is no code. The diary isn't even an interesting artifact or extract from the case. There's nothing of any interest written in a diary. It's not the kind of diary that has entries where she ruminates on things. She just writes down, as you can see here, she's written order prescription, salsa class, and then a few details about her work. On another day, she writes that she has to be in for the delivery of a washing machine because she's just moved into a house and presumably doesn't have a washing machine. So it's, to say the least, not a particularly extraordinary item, and there is certainly no confession and no code in her diary. The next statement that has been very commonly made, that was made in court, and there was a particular focus of media coverage in the immediate aftermath of Lucy's conviction, was the idea that she confessed in the green note that is on the screen currently. There are several problems with this. The first and most obvious one is that if you look at the note, it's very clearly not a confession note, and that there are overwhelmingly many more statements indicating innocence and trauma than there are statements indicating guilt. And even those statements that indicate guilt have essentially been misinterpreted. That's the first thing, and that's the most compelling aspect of this. In fact, I find it personally difficult to understand how anyone ever believes that this was a confession note, to be perfectly honest. In addition to that, we now know that this note was written as part of a counselling exercise that was suggested by Lucy's occupational health representative, Catherine DeBager, who worked for the Council of Chester Hospital. I believe she still works for the Council of Chester Hospital. We've also seen experts coming forward. There have been several now. There have been several psychologists, but there's now an expert specifically in Lucy's defence. Now the 27th expert, I think there's 28 now because of vascular surgeon. So I think it's now 28 experts acting in Lucy's defence. This expert, one of the most renowned experts in his field, who's even received CBE, he stated very clearly that the notes are just not consistent with a confession whatsoever. They don't indicate that. They indicate a nurse who is traumatised, a human being who is traumatised. And then in addition to that, there's also this blue note that I've highlighted numerous times, which indicates that this is just Lucy writing something to herself. She doesn't know this note is ever going to be found. And she knows that there's a police investigation. And she states that there's obviously no evidence. This is essentially exculpatory because if there was a police investigation and Lucy had, for example, poisoned infants with insulin, she would know there very easily could be evidence found, and therefore the fact that she indicates there's no evidence indicates her belief in her own innocence. Why does she believe that she's innocent? Because she knows that she's innocent. That's the only reason she'd be writing this in a note that she doesn't know is ever going to be found. And then in addition to that, she's referencing her colleagues and saying that none of her colleagues have been spoken to and none of her colleagues have been cited as being a suspect. Again, if she was the sole suspect, she'd poison infants. Why on earth would she be talking about her colleagues? So when you put this green note, the actual what's written in the green note, together with this exculpatory blue note, and then the pattern of the other notes, Catherine de Bega's name is written multiple times in the other notes, and there are other statements that indicate trauma and indicate innocence. Overall, the confession note has absolutely no credibility whatsoever. Although, as I said, to be perfectly honest, if I was in Cheshire Police, I would have been saying to them and to my colleagues, if I was unfortunate enough to be one of the investigating officers on this case, hold on a second, are we stupid? This isn't a confession note. This looks nothing like a confession note. It's actually laughable that this was used in court, and it was referenced. It was referenced during the closing statement very early on. It was referenced several times. It was a significant part of the prosecution case, but it's something that has absolutely no merit whatsoever. Speaking of things that have absolutely no merit whatsoever, it's my favourite part of the Lucy Letby case, which is the handover sheets. Now, I do believe this is the thing that gets mentioned the most, the fact that Lucy inadvertently took some handover sheets home in her pocket and then stored them in a Morrison's carrier bag that was tied up, indicating very clearly that they were rubbish, as did the fact that many of the sheets were found in a bin bag in the garage, which you can see on the screen now. So that's the first thing. The allegation was somehow she treasured these handover sheets. It's very clear that's not the case. And then, of course, the prosecution also mentioned that the only sheet that she'd done anything with that indicates any treasuring whatsoever dates back to 2010, which is nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. Speaking of being nothing to do with the indictment, I should mention that these handover sheets are completely unrelated to any allegations. The vast majority of them had nothing to do with the case. She didn't take handover sheets home for every infant in the case. There are numerous infants missing in the handover sheets that were recovered. And anyway, taking over the handover sheets is nothing to do with the allegations of murdering babies. This is completely unrelated to anything that was ever levelled at Lucy Letby in court. And then another thing on top of that is that nurses frequently take home handover sheets. So I've spoken to, I'm not sure how many nurses, it must be at least 100 now. There must be at least 100 nurses who have told me I've taken handover sheets home. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, I've accidentally taken things home. It wasn't as sensitive as it was in Lucy's case because it's not a hospital, and also I didn't live in a house. So as I've mentioned previously, I think some days I took them back to work and put them in the confidential waste. Maybe that happened most days, but I'm sure I threw a few in the bin and just thought, it's going into a communal waste chute, no one will ever see them. It's not a problem. Lucy couldn't do that. Lucy probably should have taken them back to work and stuck them in the confidential waste. But obviously she'd accumulated a lot because it's so easily done to just put something in your pocket. Oh, I've forgotten that was there. Then you go home. So many people must have done this in so many different jobs, in so many fields. This whole item just had absolutely no merit. Again, it's incredible to me that it's in a court case or that anyone cites it as being of any relevance whatsoever. The evidence. The next thing that was used in court were Facebook searches that Lucy made for typically parents of infants who had been on the unit. The first thing to say about this is that this is nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. It's completely unrelated to the indictment. That's the first thing. The second thing is she made an incredibly trivial number of searches compared to the number of searches she made for other people. It's known that Lucy went on Facebook regularly and regularly searched for various people. She did this 2,287 times in the period that was referred to in the court case, compared to 31 times that she searched for parents that were involved in the case. So it's an incredibly trivial thing. The next thing to mention is this doesn't have to be nefarious. It could be very normal for Lucy to be thinking, oh, I'm concerned about that parent who lost their child, or, our memories behave in a strange way. Things will come into our memories at various times for various reasons, and we can just think, oh yeah, I wonder what's happening with that. So the fact that Lucy searched for parents a trivial number of times really indicates nothing. Frankly, if this evidence was put in a GCSE project, it should be marked down by the teacher, let alone should it be in a court case where people are being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to appear and were supposed, presumably, to take it seriously. Of course, it is serious because of the consequences, but some of the material was wholly laughable, and of course the Facebook searches would be one of those items of evidence that was indeed laughable. Again, speaking of laughable evidence, we now move on to the text messages. Now, there is nothing of any substance. I've looked at every single text message that Lucy sent, and in a way I would like to do a video going through all the text messages one day, but I'm very reluctant to do that because essentially it would be an extremely boring video. Because there was nothing of any substance in any of those text messages that indicated anything nefarious, anything malignant, anything even macabre or unusual. They're extremely dull and uninteresting text messages, and that was even conceded by the police. Even the police said that there was nothing interesting in them, and that overwhelmingly the messages that Lucy had sent were completely normal. We only saw the less than 1% of text messages that could somehow be shoehorned into the case in some sort of vaguely relevant way. And even those are pathetic, with her talking about going on holiday with her parents in Devon and picking a winning horse at the Grand National and such like. There was nothing of any medical significance, and definitely nothing to indicate that Lucy had harmed any infants. And no one contests this seriously, even though it was still part of the prosecution case. Although, again, this would have been thrown out of a GCSE project if the teacher was doing their job correctly. The other aspect of the text messages is that they were used to try and indicate that Lucy had some unsavoury or inappropriate interest in one of the doctors. Unfortunately, there wasn't even a single text message that met the bar of flirtation. Not one. You would think they'd have something they could point to that indicate that they had some sort of significant relationship that went beyond a cordial friendship. Not even a super close friendship. You know, they met up a couple of times. You know, I mean, I've already spoken to someone. They haven't come on the channel, but I've interviewed them. And they knew Lucy better than this doctor. And they met Lucy more than this doctor. So the idea that Lucy's having some passionate affair, you'd surely be able to point to at least one message that indicated some minor flirtation. And I was reflecting on this when I read through these messages, because I thought, well, okay, I'm going to see something. There's going to be something a bit saucy at some point, and then there's just absolutely nothing. Like one day Lucy borrows his car or something, or he gives her a lift home or something like that. Like that's the most intimate thing they ever did in a text message. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, I hope no one ever goes through my phone. The evidence on which the next suggestion is that Lucy was somehow weird or cold. That's simply not true. There have been numerous articles now that have interviewed nurses who work with Lucy, including Karen Rees, and they've praised her demeanour, they've praised the way that she dealt with parents on the unit. I've personally spoken to people who said that she was far from cold. She's actually very, very good with parents. She was acknowledged as being good at dealing with people. So this is just completely unfounded. All of this information comes in retrospect, looking backwards from parents who've been prompted by the police. We know they were prompted by the police now because I've been through the interview of Paul Hughes by Liz Hull, and he says that we immediately went to the parents and told them that someone might have murdered their babies. This is even before I think they told the press that they're investigating. No, that's not correct. It was just after they told the press, because they told the press extremely quickly. Of course, this we'll be dealing with later, but it was certainly before they'd engaged with Dr. Evans, and it was certainly before they properly investigated. So they did everything back to front from any kind of responsible perspective, but we'll be getting into that further later in the video. So the idea that Lucy's weird or cold is untrue. She was perhaps a little bit shy. Even then she was growing out of her shyness, and she was certainly an emotional person. She was certainly someone who cared for others. That's very clear by things that she did, such as the sympathy cards, such as presents she sent, notes she sent to parents, and she had good relationships with people on the unit. But I'll be discussing the way that she interacted with parents a little bit later in this video. The next insinuation is that Lucy was somehow unpopular. Again, we know for a fact that's not true. We know for a fact she had very close friends on the unit. Her unit and her nurses that worked on the unit were very much a support team. There's pictures of her on nights out. She went to Chester races with them. They did various things together, and they clearly relied on her to some extent on the unit. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of responsibility, she was promoted above her level. And apparently that's partly because she'd worked on a tertiary unit, a level 3 neonatal unit, and so she had experience that some of the others didn't have. But you can see that it's very clear that everyone supported her, and she had very good relationships, and particularly close relationships with some of the nurses on the unit who considered her to be a close friend. The next assertion that's often made is that Lucy was a bad nurse. This is completely irrelevant, frankly, again, to the indictment. This has nothing to do with the indictment, but it's also categorically untrue. It's been now stated by many different nurses who worked on the unit. Karen Rees is one. Karen Rees was the leader of the nursing department at the Council of Chester in the neonatal service. She stated that Lucy was an excellent nurse, and we have numerous documents from the Thirlwell inquiry. I'm not going to go through all the documents and all the specific quotes in this particular video because otherwise it will go on for an enormous length of time, and I want to be able to get through all of the guilty arguments in this series, and I don't want the videos to be too long. So I will just simply say that there have been multiple statements from multiple people on the unit, but particularly the nursing managers. They wanted Lucy on the unit, to quote Karen Rees. They considered her the creme de la creme, and she was a very highly regarded nurse, and there was nothing wrong with her practice. And indeed, it was even stated by the police and the judge that Lucy Letby was an intelligent person and a very capable nurse and a good nurse. So the idea that she was a bad nurse doesn't stand up to any scrutiny whatsoever. I should also mention that a neonatal nurse has examined all the Datex information that is available for me, and she concluded that Lucy's practice was outstanding and that she was very committed to improving standards on the unit. And this is also corroborated by Karen Rees again, who said that Lucy does everything by the book. Indeed, that was perhaps to some extent her downfall, possibly in relation to the Datex, which could have enraged consultants. And also, in an interview that I'm going to be releasing in the next couple of weeks, there'll be some further discussion of something that Lucy did on the unit that was very responsible and the right thing to do, but that has been used against her. The next suggestion that I'll deal with very quickly is that Lucy was a psychopath. There is literally no evidence for this whatsoever. There is nothing about her background, there's nothing about her behaviour that is in any way indicative of any psychopathy, and for anyone to go on television, frankly, and say that Lucy was born with psychopathic tendencies is completely unprofessional and quite frankly laughable. There's just no evidential support for this whatsoever. Similarly, it has been suggested by Judith Morris and Jonathan Coffey in their book that Lucy could possibly have borderline personality disorder. So I've assessed, I can tell myself that this is total rubbish again, but I've spoken to psychiatrists on this matter, and they said, if you look at the symptoms that are associated with borderline personality disorder, which often involves a lot of instability, it can involve, like, for example, substance addiction, and there were many other things. What is written on the screen here in The Independent is, again, laughable, ridiculous, embarrassing. There is no evidence whatsoever that Lucy has borderline personality disorder. There is absolutely no correlation with this whatsoever. We can say almost with total confidence that if you were able to diagnose Lucy and sit down and have a psychological assessment with her, that she would not be found to have borderline personality disorder. This is just completely untrue. So the next thing that I've already mentioned previously was the notion that Lucy interacted poorly with parents or somehow behaved suspiciously. Now, before we go into this in a little bit more depth, again, I want to emphasise that this all came from things that were remembered by parents after they were prompted by the police. No one said anything about her at the time. In fact, Lucy had favourable relationships with numerous parents that worked on the unit. She had a particularly close relationship with the parents of Child E and Child F from the court case. So this was all remembered after the fact, after the police essentially just upset the parents because of the way they chose to run the investigation, which was, in my view, incompetent. But we have an example on the screen here from the Guardian newspaper. This is from 2018 when Lucy was first named. And we see a finance worker, 36-year-old finance worker, who praised Lucy for pushing for their infant to be transferred because he was very ill and she didn't want him to be discharged. The whole time I was there, I can't fault them. They were busy. You couldn't have long conversation with them or anything, but I can't fault the treatment of myself or my son. I can't say anything negative about Lucy. She supported me and she pushed for him to be transferred and only discharged when he was better. She told me every step of the way what was happening. I couldn't be at the hospital 24/7 because I also had a 20-month-old daughter at home, but I never felt like I couldn't trust them. I was rather shocked when I saw her picture. My son could have had more complications if it wasn't for her pushing for him to be sent to Alder Hey, so I'm grateful for that. And he is now a thriving 5-year-old, and he's got no lasting damage. He hasn't had any trouble since he came out. So that's just one example. We've seen many other examples. As I say, I'm not going to go over all the examples in this video, but numerous parents have said Lucy treated my infant well during the time that they were on the unit. And we know that she had a good relationship with parents, and other nurses have said that she had a good relationship with parents. So the idea that she behaved poorly or was awkward or didn't interact well with them, or that there were somehow red flags in her interactions with parents, is again completely without foundation. Another instance or incident, it's barely even an incident, it doesn't really deserve to be described as an incident, but something that was cited in court was that Lucy took a photograph of a sympathy card. Now, overwhelming likelihood here is that Lucy felt sad for the parents who'd lost a child and had sent them a sympathy card herself. And indeed, she engaged in numerous acts of this nature, just basic kindness towards parents who've been through traumatic or difficult experiences on the unit. In one of my interviews with Michelle Warden, she said that she still has relationships with people that go back decades to when they were actually on the unit, but she's remained in touch with them. And this is something nurses try to do. Nurses try to be the advocate for the patient, as it's been described to me. And the sad thing is, one of the consequences of the Lucy Letby case is that I know some nurses now don't feel they can be the patient advocate and don't feel they can have this closeness with the parents. And that's a great shame. In addition to this bizarre and deeply inappropriate criticism of Lucy sending a sympathy card and taking a photograph of it, it should also be noted that other nurses on the unit, as is stated in the New Yorker article that you can see an extract from on the screen here, 3 nurses attended the funeral of that infant. The only reason Lucy didn't attend the funeral was because she was working at the time. So the idea that this is some sort of red flag or some sort of odd behaviour, which is fairly ridiculous in the first place, that's completely disqualified immediately by the fact that other nurses also behave similarly towards the parents of this child. The next assertion that was made, I think more before we knew about this case. Now we have a lot of details, so this one has slipped away into the tall grass somewhat. But at one time it was stated that the entire system at the hospital was blinking red and that everyone was suspicious about Lucy Letby. Of course, we now know this is complete rubbish. We know for a fact that none of the other nurses on the unit had any suspicions or any concerns about Lucy, including her managers. And indeed, she was about to go back to working on the unit. And this would be the proper thing to do, considering that she'd won a grievance procedure. Every single point had been upheld in that grievance procedure, and she wanted to return to the unit. They rated her very highly as a nurse. They wanted her back on the unit, and they tried to pave the way for this to happen. And this was days away from occurring. So to say that the system was blinking red is completely untrue. All of the allegations emanate from Dr. Stephen Brary. Dr. Stephen Brary was the ringleader on the unit. He ran a 2-year campaign against them. He essentially brought other doctors, other consultants onto his side. I believe he was quite manipulative in doing this. The fact is that there was no indication that Lucy had done anything wrong. No other nurses had any suspicions about Lucy. We see statements to the Thirlwell inquiry, statements from every single nurse on the unit, indicating that they had no concerns about Lucy, they had no concerns about her practice. And as you see here, this was Janet Cox, but there are several other nurses as well who indicate strongly that they believe Lucy Letby to be innocent. So far from the system blinking red, the complete opposite is the case. The next allegation that is often made is that Lucy was seen behaving strangely. So this is often due to misinterpretation of her behaviour on the unit. Actually, she didn't do anything strange at all. She did what would normally be expected of a nurse on a neonatal unit. Her interactions were good, her relationships with nurses were good, her practice was good. Everything points to Lucy being an excellent nurse, as I've explored myself in another video on this channel. The other suggestion is that Lucy was caught or Lucy was seen engaging in nefarious acts. It suggested that she was caught, for example, I think thrusting a tool down the throat of an infant was one allegation. There's another allegation that she was seen looking over a baby suspiciously that we're going to address shortly. And there are various other things. Supposedly, Lucy was seen doing this or Lucy was seen doing that, and it was supposedly nefarious or supposedly suspicious. In actual fact, it's uncontested evidence that no one saw Lucy Letby doing anything wrong. Every incident that I've just mentioned has perfectly normal explanations. When you speak to nurses, they explain what she was doing, why she was doing it, and the assertion that Lucy was caught doing anything nefarious simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The next item on the list is the assertion that Lucy was stood over an infant in court. This is already a strange phrasing that makes it sound more threatening and sinister than it otherwise would be. But it's also important to note that what Lucy was actually doing was what you're supposed to do as a neonatal nurse, which is engaging in a period of observation. This has been confirmed to me now by numerous neonatal nurses, and the way that it was presented in court is kind of despicable, really, because they're saying that she shouldn't have done her job properly. Of course, there were other instances of this in relation to this supposed boyfriend theory. The prosecution stated that she'd somehow called him at one stage to get attention when actually she was just doing a job and calling him to an incident on the unit that was alarming. So this notion that she was stood over baby suspiciously is completely erroneous. In addition, it was also suggested that Lucy did nothing at times. Now, what both of these claims have in common, again, is that they emanate and originate from parents of infants on the unit. Now, none of them, firstly, reported anything unusual at the time, but it's also important to note, and I don't say this disrespectfully, but they simply don't know anything about what is required from a neonatal nurse. So what they have then interpreted as suspicious behaviour after the police have prompted them is actually perfectly normal conduct, which is indeed literally exactly what Lucy is supposed to do. In fact, I've cited in another video that there is a direct comment from Ravi Jairam where he's speaking to parents, and he states that it's normal to have a period of observation. You don't just delve into the incubator. You don't act without knowing what's happening. This is something that Michelle has spoken about, Michelle Warden, when I interviewed her, and it will be common knowledge for nurses that are watching this video, and indeed all over the country, if not all over the world. The next suggestion that I want to address is that Lucy was caught red-handed. So this applies to two instances in the court case, one of which relates to child K, which I'll deal with first. So the prosecution witness used testimony given by the aforementioned Dr. Ravi Jairam to suggest that Lucy had been caught virtually red-handed. Of course, this is a completely nonsense concept, and Jairam's testimony was deeply unconvincing even before we found out that he'd given a different account previously. The other instance in which it was suggested that Lucy had been caught red-handed, you can see on the screen now. This is from the closing statement of Nick Johnson, who was the prosecuting barrister, and he makes this comment: when the mother of baby E and F caught Lucy Letby red-handed. As I've pointed out in previous videos, this is just simply a lie. I'm not sure how this was allowed to appear in court. It's uncontested evidence, agreed evidence from both sides that no one saw Lucy do anything wrong. We know no one saw Lucy do anything wrong. So for him to say that the mother of baby E and F caught Lucy Letby red-handed is total rubbish. If indeed that was true, one would have expected the mother of baby E and F to raise something at the time, which of course she didn't. In fact, as I mentioned, we know that they had a very close relationship. Both the parents of baby E and baby F were very thankful towards Lucy, and Lucy felt particularly moved by what had occurred to them because they had such a good relationship. So this assertion that Lucy was caught red-handed in the court case is yet another complete falsehood. Another assertion that I've heard made is that the consultants who raised suspicions regarding Lucy Letby and became obsessed indeed with the idea that she was guilty had some sort of damning evidence against her. We now know this to be completely untrue because when the case was passed to the police, as you can see on the screen now, and as I've established in previous videos, the police stated quite clearly that there was no evidence other than coincidence because no evidence had been passed to them. In the consultants' report that was mainly authored by Dr. Stephen Breary, that was passed over to the police on the 10th of May, we also know that there was very little evidence because most of it has now been redacted because it all related to infants that were nothing to do with the court case. And then if you look at the report compared to what they said on the 15th of May, there is very little overlap between the two. The assertions that they made and that they communicated to the police are simply bogus, and they never managed to provide any meaningful evidence for any of their suspicions. They're pretty much unfounded and very strange suspicions that Lucy Letby was somehow interfering with infants in the neonatal unit. The next myth that I'd like to address is that the consultants were brave whistleblowers. So I've spoken to the head of a whistleblowing charity, Compassion in Care. The lady in question is called Eileen Chubb, and she's already stated, she's been in the Daily Telegraph, it's been very clearly commented by her publicly and also to me privately that the consultants were not whistleblowers at all, let alone were they brave. The reason for this that she gave to me is that she simply said that the consultants their behaviour and their conduct isn't consistent with any of the criteria that she would associate with being a whistleblower. However, that isn't a controversial remark because Ravi Jairam himself recognised that they weren't whistleblowers. When meeting with the Cheshire Constabulary on the 15th of May, he states here, "It is regarded as whistleblowing if you go outside. We have taken advice from our medical defence unions to do everything with a trust and deal that route." So here he is indicating his unwillingness to be a whistleblower. And in fact, if the consultants were brave, then they would have put themselves on the line a year earlier, because there's an email from one of the doctors at that time stating that we have to make ourselves, if we're serious about raising these suspicions about Lucy Letby and raising our suspicions that there may be criminal acts on the neonatal unit, then we have to be treated as suspects and we have to open ourselves up to a police investigation. And it's nearly a year. This is roughly around the time that Lucy is thrown off the neonatal unit. There's nearly another year before it's finally referred to the police, and it was never referred by the consultants. The consultants did nothing that was courageous and everything that was cowardly, and they're not whistleblowers. They did everything possible to ensure that they could never be put in a vulnerable position. They delayed referring it to the police as long as possible. They tried to put pressure on the hospital to make the referral. So they're not whistleblowers, and they're certainly not brave. The next assertion that is commonly made is that the hospital should have referred this case to the police more quickly. Now, I've pretty much covered all the reasons already why this is not the case, but you can see on the screen now a statement here by a legal representative, Corinne Slingo, who states, "There does not currently appear to be any reason to formally alert the police to these issues, as there is nothing upon which one might reasonably base a suspicion of a criminal offence having been committed." Now, the hospitals and the executive were very much aware of that. I suspect the consultants were also aware of that as well. So the idea that it should have been referred more quickly is without foundation, because even when it was referred, it was still referred to the police with no evidence. And then I'd like to say, in addition to that, the arrests of the executives from the hospital, 3 executives, is, in my view, despicable, because they couldn't possibly have done anything differently. And the police know very well that when the case was referred to them, it was referred to them with no evidence. And when the police met with executives on the 12th of May, it was agreed by both parties that there was no basis for a police investigation. So I consider those arrests to be erroneous and egregious, and the idea that it should have been referred more quickly is just simply not supported evidentially, because when it was finally referred, it was referred with no evidence. The next myth that I would like to address, and the pro-guilty assertion that is often made, is that the police had no choice other than to initiate a criminal investigation. In fact, we know that the complete opposite is the case, and that if Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam hadn't met with the police on the 15th of May 2017, there would have been no police investigation. On the 12th of May 2017, there was an internal meeting at Cheshire Police at Blacon in Chester for Operation Hummingbird after a meeting with the 3 executives, and it was stated, at this stage, the County Chester exhausted all lines possible, and there is nothing that could potentially be evidence for criminal investigation. The concerns raised by the consultants have been raised previously, and there is nothing they are aware of that they would consider or believe that potential criminal offences may have been committed. It's interesting that, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the police did nothing to investigate the consultants, both in terms of holding them to account as potential suspects, but also looking into the grievance procedure, for example, that Lucy Letby was successful with and had all 7 points upheld. As is mentioned here, the concerns that had been raised by the consultants on the unit had already been raised previously, and when they actually met with the police on the 15th of May, they presented nothing new whatsoever, and they also presented nothing new whatsoever in the document that they'd forwarded on the 10th of May. So to say that the police had no choice is absolutely untrue. There were numerous other things that they could have done, but they certainly didn't need to go pedal to the metal, immediate intention to investigate. Within 3 days, it's in the newspaper, it's in the Guardian newspaper. They've already written to the Guardian newspaper or contacted them saying, we're going to do an investigation into this case. So they're not even investigating quietly in the background. It's already clear it was full steam ahead, even as early as the 18th of May, and just days previous to that, they had no intention of investigating. So to say that the police had no choice, again, is completely without foundation. It's also reasonable to say, based on this Guardian article that we can see on the screen here from the 18th of May, that assertions that I've read online that the police made a very diligent decision to prosecute are again unfounded. They made this decision in a matter of a couple of days, based entirely, it seems, on a meeting that they held with Jairam and Breary. So to describe that as diligent is, I think, just completely without foundation again. The next pro-guilty argument I often hear is that the police investigation was thorough. Now, I can certainly agree that it took a very long time, because it was over 5 years from the initialisation of this investigation to Lucy appearing in court for the first time. I can't agree that it was thorough, because we now know for a fact that the main reason it took so long is that Dr. Evans kept repeatedly writing reports, and he wrote many, even the majority of these reports, after he knew that Lucy Letby was a suspect. Despite the fact that he's repeatedly claimed, I didn't know the name of Lucy Letby. He's always saying this when he hasn't even been asked about it, quite possibly because of a guilty conscience, because he knows extremely well that he wrote most of the reports for most of the infants on which Lucy was convicted when he definitely knew the name of Lucy Letby because she'd been arrested, and he wrote most of them after that date. He kept mucking around with things, changing things around, changing even the methods of murder, let alone the details, after he knew the name of Lucy, let alone So let me add as well. He obviously, I should emphasise, he changed one report in the case of Chelsea when he's staring back at her in the witness box, and even after the conviction. We also know from recent information that was contained in a podcast from the Daily Mail that when Lucy was arrested for the first time, only Dr. Evans had provided evidence at this point, none of the other experts. So they'd already decided that Lucy was a suspect at this time. There's some fairly absurd comment from Paul Hughes in that particular podcast where he's claiming that they had to afford Lucy the rights of a suspect. So the only way we could speak to her was to arrest her, as if the only way the police can speak to someone is to arrest them. So they spoke to numerous other people. I've spoken to some people that they spoke with, and they didn't arrest any of them. So obviously they were singling Lucy out as being a suspect, quite obviously. It's also important to note that the police didn't actually investigate anything that Lucy told them. So they said, "Oh, we're arresting Lucy because she knows more about the case than anyone else." But then we know for a fact they disregarded everything that she told them. But that's consistent with what, for example, Michelle Warden has told us, where she contacted the police, asking them about the Royal College report, other items of evidence, other important things around the hospital. And then, of course, they completely ignored her. And all they wanted to know is if you got any dirt on Lucy. They completely ignored everything Lucy said in the interviews. They completely ignored anything positive that anyone said about Lucy. They completely ignored any context. We know that for a fact. Now, I don't know whether Paul Hughes genuinely believes what he's saying is true in these podcasts, or if he's trying to mount some sort of disingenuous shield for himself. But what I can say quite confidently is that this was not a thorough investigation. This was an investigation that focused on Lucy Letby very quickly. The reason it focused on Lucy was because Breary and Jayram walked into the police station, gave the police a load of information, much of it inaccurate, and then with a matter of days, the police had gone from "there's no reason to have an investigation" to "we'll release the information to the Guardian and we'll definitely investigate now." Then Dr. Evans walks in. Within a matter of minutes, he says, "Oh, there's definitely 100% inflicted harm. Give me all the medical notes and then I'll work it out so that we have a definite crime here." And we know from the comments of the police as well that it's very clear that they only really looked at Lucy as a possible explanation. There's occasional comments suggesting or implying that they looked at other possibilities, but they always assessed everything in this blanket way of it either has to definitely 100% be this or it definitely has to be 100% that. And that's again evidenced by the fact that when Lucy was arrested and interviewed, and I could tell this when I was reading through the interview transcript myself, but Paul Hughes made it crystal clear in the Mail podcast, they were expecting Lucy to give herself an alibi and explain everything with a silver bullet explanation for what occurred on the unit, to explain everything away so they could say, "Oh yeah, well that makes sense. Sorry to bother you, Lucy, we shouldn't really arrested you." Utterly ridiculous. So in the Operation Hummingbird documentary, it mentions a so-called bug that could have been present on the unit. Now, there were infections on the unit, but that doesn't mean, of course, that they were solely responsible. Both the panel and other critics of the conviction believe that sepsis is extremely important. We believe Pseudomonas is important. We believe other infections that occurred were important. But neither the panel nor any of the people that are critical of the conviction believe that sepsis is completely to blame for everything that occurred on the unit. That would be preposterous. It's not even necessarily completely to blame for the collapse or death of one infant or any particular infant. It's a contributing factor in numerous infants, because what you're looking at is a nuanced and complex clinical picture. The police clearly had no ability to understand this, which, to be fair, they do admit themselves. They say, "We have no medical understanding, we have no medical knowledge." They don't go as far as saying they don't really know what they're doing, but that's very clear from the public statements. So I don't think it's even tenable to suggest that this was a thorough police investigation. They were put in a very difficult situation and they dealt with it very badly. It took a very long time, I'm happy to concede that, but there's a big difference between something taking a long time and something being thorough. And this investigation was definitely not thorough for several really obvious reasons. The evidence. So let me just go through a few of those quickly. They didn't investigate the consultants properly. Very little investigation of the circumstances at the hospital, if any. It's generous to describe it as the level of investigation is very little. They interviewed Lucy because it was supposedly important and then discarded literally everything that she said. There was no due diligence on Evans, or indeed basically any due diligence at all. There's no nuanced medical understanding from the police. They didn't seek a second opinion on anything. They jumped to conclusions rapidly, and they cancelled the work of Professor Jane Hutton for no good reason. We also often hear that there were loads of experts involved in giving their expert opinion to the police. So firstly, aside from Dr. Evans, the input of experts in this case is very minimal, as I'll be discussing in a future video on this topic. I can't go over every topic in this video, it would take too long, but we'll be assessing the role of experts in the future. What we do know for a fact that it's important to point out is that at the time that Lucy was first arrested, they only had input from Dr. Evans. So they had already basically decided that Lucy was guilty because they're arresting her. They don't arrest her for no good reason. And basically, when they arrested her, they thought, right, if Lucy can't give us a silver bullet medical explanation for absolutely everything that happened on the unit, then we'll just treat her as guilty based on the evidence of Dr. Evans. So the idea that loads of experts were involved with the police investigation, the fact is, apart from Dr. Evans, there was very minimal involvement with anyone else. So again, this is just singularly untrue. Another assertion, this is a rather desperate assertion that you'll hear from pro-guilty people, is that Lucy had a fair trial. Now, by this point in time, I don't think anyone could possibly believe, anyone who's objective could possibly believe that Lucy had a fair trial. Everything was weighted enormously against her in terms of witnesses, in terms of the amount of resources, in terms of the possibility and the opportunity that the defence had to respond to things, and in terms of the orders that and decisions that the judge made in court. The way that the prosecution case had been structured by the police and the prosecution made it extremely difficult to defend against, even if the defence were given the same level of resources. What this has resulted in is a chronically unsafe conviction, but I'm going to move on to talk about the judge a little more in due course. Another assertion is often made, this has been made by Judith Moritz, I'd love to see her in the same situation, is that Lucy gave a bad account of herself in court and that she somehow tied herself in knots. I don't think it was a 10 out of 10 performance from Lucy in court, but bear in mind she's under the massive pressure of knowing that she could face multiple life sentences, and then she had a breakdown, suffering with very serious post-traumatic stress disorder shortly before the court case began, and it had to be delayed for a certain period of time while she recovered. So she's hardly likely to be firing on all cylinders. And then it's very, very difficult to get up there in the witness box and face these barristers. And people often say, barristers are very skillful at what they do and they're very highly trained, and of course that's true, and I don't. That's an issue in and of itself. But I also want people to consider this: they have enormous advantages over any witness. It's not easy for a witness to defend themselves when they're up against a barrister, and Lucy was in a very difficult situation because she wasn't there as an expert witness. She was there to defend herself. We had Dr. Evans as an expert witness in the witness box that we're going to discuss again in the next couple of points. And he really, really struggled, despite the fact he's been in court loads of times, despite the fact that he's supposed to be a qualified doctor. Of course he isn't. It was still really, really difficult for him, and Myers ran absolute rings around him. Much worse than Lucy, 10 times worse than Lucy. Lucy gave a very good account of herself in the witness box. She showed herself to be very knowledgeable. She showed herself to be honest. She gave honest answers. She didn't rely on scapegoating other people. She defended other people that worked in the hospital. She just came across as an honest person giving the best answers she possibly could. And when she couldn't remember something, she just said, I can't remember. She perhaps presented as a little bit passive, a little bit monosyllabic at times, but the girls had a breakdown. I mean, she was in an extraordinarily difficult situation. And as witness performances in court go, she gave a good account of herself. It's notable that Peter Hitchens said in the immediate aftermath of the trial that he was impressed by the fact that she's willing to put herself in the witness box and put herself up against a professional barrister. Now, his wife is a barrister and he knows how difficult it is. So he's not going to say that lightly. And we know more about what Lucy said. And also, it's important to emphasise as well, I've got one of these examples on the screen now, but, this is another, let's move on to another pro-guilty accusation that Lucy lied in court. So she was asked about the most ridiculous things. The only two so-called lies that were possible to uncover during the court process was that Lucy had supposedly lied about owning a shredder and Lucy had supposedly lied about wearing pyjamas. In fact, Lucy was accurately describing the fact that she was wearing nightwear and clothes that she'd worn to bed and that she wouldn't usually have taken she wouldn't have usually worn outside. So that's a perfectly reasonable description. As for not owning a shredder, I've mentioned numerous times in numerous previous videos, I don't know if I have a shredder in my house or not because I bought one many years ago. I don't know, it might be 20 years ago now. And I can't remember if I transported it around. I never use it. I don't have any intention of using it. But it could be in my house. It may not be in my house. I've done a little search for it, but I can't find it anywhere. So I could have thrown it in the attic upstairs, or it may be in the back of a cupboard. I don't know. But it would be very surprising if any person who has a reasonable sized house could do 100% accurate inventory of their entire house. So, I'd be impressed. Nick Johnson was there for the prosecution asking her this question. I'd be pretty impressed if Nick Johnson could do a 100% accurate inventory of his own house. And then, if he got one item wrong, like on the Generation game, except on a much bigger scale, because there'd be many more items in a house than going along on a conveyor belt. So, you said you didn't have a strimmer in the back garden, Nick, but you actually do. Oh, well, I'd forgotten about it. Well, and then they had this ridiculous exchange where he's saying, how much does a shredder cost? So I'd like to put Nick Johnson in the witness box and say, have you just got money to throw around on a strimmer then, Nick? Well, I know you have because you're a highly paid barrister. And it's pretty insulting for you to be making these comments to Lucy when you know damn well she's got nowhere near the amount of money that you've got. So the idea that Lucy lied in court is just total rubbish. What she said about pyjamas was correct. The shredder issue is of no importance whatsoever. And then, in addition to that, there were certain suggestions about certain moments, but none of those things can be shown to be lies. And she never lied about anything of any significance. That's an absolute certainty. That's known to be the case. And that can be decided immediately by the very fact that the only two lies that people bring forward are about the pyjamas and about the shredder, neither of which are anything to do with the case whatsoever. They're not even anything to do with the hospital. They're just stupid things that the prosecution brought up because it seems that in a court case in this country, you can bring up absolutely anything. The evidence. So the next claim that will often be made is that Judge James Goss, who presided over the case, was a very experienced judge and he handled the case fairly. So I'm sure that he didn't intend to be unfair, but I cannot agree with this verdict. Many decisions, the vast majority of the decisions, it seems virtually every decision in the court case went against the interests of Lucy Letby. For example, Judge Goss excluded the Royal College report that gave critical context on the hospital in which Lucy Letby worked. He allowed the entire prosecution case to be heard before the defence was able to give its case rather than having infants heard individually. He allowed a majority verdict in court, which is particularly associated with miscarriages of justice. He made very little interjection when the prosecution was making either spurious or completely false claims. That's if he made any interjections at all. And finally, when Lord Justice Jackson wrote to Judge James Goss indicating that Dr. Evans may be an unsuitable witness, he failed to exclude him from the process, which, given what we've seen since then, should definitely have happened. So it's certainly the case that decisions made by the judge and the general attitude with which the judge ran the court case worked quite systematically against Lucy Letby. So the next pro-guilt argument is that Dr. Evans was a credible witness and gave a good account of himself in court. Now, there can't be many people that believe this at this point in time. I suppose that it's possible that some people believe that he gave a good account of himself in court because they haven't read the court transcripts or encountered what actually occurred in court. I certainly think there'll be an extremely limited number of people that would say Dr. Evans is a credible witness at this point in time, particularly considering his performance in the Channel 4 documentary, which it would be generous to describe that as embarrassing for him. But leaving that issue aside, his performance in the court case was abysmal. Time and time again, he was absolutely torn to shreds, and it was a train wreck, really. And that it's the level of his performance, which was spectacularly poor, is indicative of how unfair the court case was. Because despite the fact that he was destroyed in the witness box time and time again, and he showed himself to be so unreliable and so far removed from what you would expect from an expert witness, even Judge Goss, that was one of the good things that Judge Goss actually did do, was interrupt him several times and say, Dr. Evans, you've already told us this several times. Because he got fed up with him because this guy is a complete shyster. Everyone knows that by now. Anyone that thinks that if you defend Dr. Evans at this point in time, you make yourself look like an idiot. You're basically saying and advertising to people, I am an idiot. You might as well, rather than say, oh, I think Dr. Evans is credible, or I think Dr. Evans did well in court, you might as well just say, I am an idiot. His performance was abysmal. I've got one particularly egregious example on the screen now, where he was trying to claim there was 45 millilitres of milk. Anyone with any medical qualifications will look at what he said in regard to that infant and treat it with complete derision. And that indeed, that is how Dr. Evans is treated now, with complete derision. So the idea that he gave a good account of himself in court is laughable. It was an absolute car crash. The next assertion that Dr. Evans himself will make, and that other people who wish to defend the idea that Lucy Letby is guilty will also make, is that there were loads of other experts in court. Now, I've been over this in previous videos, and you see that for all of the experts other than Evans and Bohin, they only dealt with a very small number of cases. So Stivaros and Kenny, I've mentioned these two several times previously, they did nothing at all. But even the other witnesses didn't really appear very much at all. They didn't appear for the vast majority of infants. And then they all received a steer from Dr. Evans. So Marnaridis, for example, was basing his opinion very much on the reports of Dr. Evans. But you can also see on the screen now, if you look at child A and child B as an example, so you have parents' statements, grandmother's statement, police analyst, recorded events and messages. That's all basically worthless. Police analyst, recorded events and messages on the second day, Tuesday 18th of October. Still, absolutely, there's no medical information whatsoever yet. Police analysts, recorded events and messages, other agreed facts, and then we get some statements from midwife, Dr. Gelbeach, Dr. Andrew Brunton, unnamed doctor trainee, nurse Melanie Taylor. Then Thursday 20th of October, Melanie Taylor again, Harkness, Christopher Wood, Lisa Walker, Joanne Williams. More statements from people at the hospital. Then finally, Professor Owen Arthurs comes in and says, yeah, there's air, but it doesn't prove anything. Then on the 24th of October, Nurse A, Rachel Lammy, Ravi Jairam. And then finally, we get a couple of days of Dewi Evans and Sandy Bohin with no other experts at all. Then we're back to police interviews, parent statements, police analyst. So much of this case is nonsense analysis from the police, nonsense circumstantial evidence. I don't want to describe what the parents said as nonsense because I think that's unfair. They obviously feel very traumatised by what occurred and understandably they wanted to have their say. But from an evidential basis, the accounts of parents don't have any value at all. They don't have any medical value because they don't have any medical knowledge. And it's not as if anyone saw anything. As we've already established, there is no concrete evidence in this case and there is no circumstantial evidence where someone says, I saw Lucy Letby do this, it's nefarious, it is inflicted harm, and it's corroborated. None of the parents say this, no one claims this, no one believes this to be the case. So as you can see, and this is a pattern that's repeated throughout all the infants, even the input of Evans and Bohin is relatively small compared to the amount of time that was spent discussing some of these cases, but the other experts barely appear. And that's true anyway. You can look at that very clearly if you just look at the infants that they were assigned to. But if you look at the actual court proceedings, a lot of it is circumstantial evidence from the police, various aspects of police analysis. I've been over this in previous videos. It's all complete tripe, basically. Eyewitness statements from the parents who haven't witnessed anything, and then a load of people from the hospital saying we didn't know what had gone wrong, and then giving a load of details that have nothing to do with the allegations. And then it's only really a little bit of Dr. In the case of Child A and Child B, we virtually hear from no one else at all. A little bit from Owen Arthur saying, yeah, there was some air, but it doesn't prove anything, and I can't endorse the theories of Dr. Evans. It's not possible for me to do so. So the idea that there were loads of other experts in court that Dr. Evans liked to suggest, firstly, two of the experts did nothing. Dr. Bohin did a very inappropriate peer review, and then there's only a few other experts left, and really they contributed very little indeed. Another argument that's often put forward is that, it was a 10-month case, so therefore it was a really strong prosecution case. But in actual fact, the longer that a court case takes, the weaker that the evidence is, because if there's strong definitive evidence, then it's very easy to make a quick decision, and usually those cases don't take up a long period of time. I mentioned the O.J. Simpson case that dragged on for months with loads of nonsense evidence, and you see the same in this case. But I've just shown you what happened for each infant. They spent ages just going over a load of stuff that is total rubbish. And we saw that in the cross-examining Lucy Letby, just absolute nonsense all the way through it. So the fact this was a 10-month case, if there had been definitive concrete evidence, if there'd been very strong witness statements, or if they had very strong concrete medical evidence, it wouldn't have lasted 10 months. They would have put the strong evidence forward quickly, and then the defence would have had to counter that. So the fact this is a 10-month case indicates actually that there was weak evidence, not that there was strong evidence. And the final assertion that I wish to address in this video is the comment that the jury took a long time to deliberate, therefore it was a very thorough examination of the evidence. Now, I'm sure the jury did their absolute best that they could in very difficult circumstances. Frankly, it's a nightmare being asked to be on that jury where they were in court for 10 months, not being remunerated properly, very difficult conditions, very traumatic. And I'm certainly not critical of the jury in the Lucy Letby case. However, there's two important things that I just need to mention. The first one is that the jury just cannot understand this case. That is way too complex for them. There's all manners of medical information and nursing information that it's just impossible for them to know or understand unless they have either medical knowledge, which they don't have, or the opportunity to research, which they're not given because it's contempt of court. So the chance of them being able to understand the case are extremely minimal. Of course, they're very reliant on quality expert evidence, which is conspicuous by its absence in this case, but I would say it's often conspicuous by its absence in the British court system, and this is something that needs to be addressed rapidly. And then the second thing, of course, is that the jury didn't see an enormous amount of really important information that has been revealed, unveiled, unearthed since the court case was concluded. So under those circumstances, they can spend from now until the end of time assessing the case. It's only as good as the information they're given. I mean, everyone's heard the expression garbage in, garbage out. This court case is a classic example of that. It's almost an illustration of that. It is a court case that will be studied across multiple subjects in universities for decades and possibly centuries to come. So the idea that the jury deliberating for a long time means that it's therefore a legitimate verdict is untenable. In conclusion, claims that are often made about Lucy Letby and the trial of Lucy Letby collapse under the weight of further examination. Unfortunately, in the court case itself, this fair and balanced examination of the evidence never occurred. That says more about the criminal justice system in this country than it does about the guilt or innocence of Lucy Letby. It's very clear by now that the criminal justice system in this country is failing and that there needs to be an enormous restructuring of how it operates. Whether anyone will have the guts to do that, I don't know. The prosecution in this court case used what I have described as a shit-flinging technique, where they liberally tossed around as much dirt as possible and hoped that some of it stuck. I suspect that this is a common prosecution strategy in numerous court cases. Considering this shit-flinging approach, it therefore shouldn't come as an enormous surprise that so much of what they asserted has absolutely no foundation or basis whatsoever. Nonetheless, there can still be some confusion with people believing that certain claims made both in the court case and online have credibility and are evidentially supported, when in fact they are not. I should emphasise that this will be a multi-part series examining every claim of guilt that I can possibly dig up. I will try not to exclude any, but it is difficult to ensure that every single one is identified. This video definitely doesn't even scratch the surface, but I'm just examining a few areas to begin with. There will be many more videos in this series over the weeks and months to come. Despite the fact that I've already made, I think, maybe 90 videos now, I haven't even scratched the surface of this case. There'll be a lot more content to come. Rest assured, that's an absolute certainty. Finally, I'll just mention that I forgot to include the infamous paper towel allegation in this video, so I don't claim to be infallible. If you're interested in that, this was one of my more popular videos, and it's a truly surreal and incredible allegation from the prosecution, which can only be described as utterly ridiculous. And then finally, in conclusion, I just wanted to reiterate my best wishes to Mark Mays, who's taking a little break at the moment, and just to emphasise again that he and others were an inspiration to me, and I have huge respect for people who put themselves out there online. That very much paved the way for me, and it's my job to pick up the baton now and run with it, and that's what I'm going to do. So I just wanted to give Mark my best wishes and make that clear again, and also just to say to him that you shouldn't feel pressurised to come back. Make sure you give yourself a good break. Your health and well-being must always be your number one priority, because if you don't have that, you have nothing at all. We all care very much about this case and Lucy's well-being, but it's not going to help anyone if you're not in good fettle yourself, so please ensure that you take the time that you need, and we all wish you well.